Hey everybody, this is Russ from Gamecore. So the other day I reviewed this device here, the Anbernic RG353P, and I gave it a mostly positive review. If I had to assign a number, I would say maybe a 7.5 out of 10. Well, here we are 2 days later, and there's already custom firmware called JELOS available for this device. And this does change the paradigm for this device quite a bit. Now, a lot of those higher end systems, things like Dreamcast, PlayStation Portable, and Sega Saturn play a lot better. And on top of that, this Linux-based custom firmware does bring a lot of new features and improves the overall user experience. And so in this video, I'm going to just do a quick feature overview of JELOS, and then we're also going to spend some time going over some of those higher end systems that didn't play so great on stock firmware. And I think you might be pleased by these results. So without any further delay, let's jump into it. Now, JELOS stands for Just Enough Linux Operating System, and the developer who created this operating system is the same one that created 351elec back in the day. Since then, they've forked the original 351elec and streamlined it, and that's what we have now. And so this is an operating system that is focused on simplicity and just getting into the games. And it's already available in stable forms for the RG351 devices, as well as the RG552 and the RG503. And the fact that it's already been developed for the RG503 is the reason why we're getting it on the 353 so soon, because these two devices share the same chipset, which means that that same work was carried over to the 353. Now, the 353 version is currently under the development build repository, but it's going to be moved over to stable by the time I release this video, and I'll have links to this in the video description. But long story short, under the releases page, you'll find all these different assets, and we only want one file here, and that's the one that says RG353P, and it has an img.gz file. So all you want to do is download that file here, and then use an app like Balena Etcher to flash that file onto an SD card. After that, you put that SD card into the device, which will then partition everything and get it set up, and then add another blank SD card into the second slot here, and that's going to populate the card with a bunch of folders, which you would then use to add your BIOS and game files. And then on the JELOS website, which is again linked in the video description, it'll walk you through all the different folders and which systems are supported, as well as which game files to use and whether or not there are any sort of BIOS you need to use too. And so I recommend following the instructions on the wiki page to get this all set up. But let me show you some of the features that'll be available once you have it up and running. Number one is most of the configurations that you want to do are actually going to be within the emulation station menu. And so you can go into the game settings here and then adjust everything to your specific requirements. A lot of these have been pre-configured already, but there are a few that I like to tweak myself. For example, I like to turn off the rewind function, and then I also like to turn on auto save and load, but only to show the save states if they are available. If you want to go into the weeds more, you can go into the per system advanced configuration. And within here, you can set things up. For example, I like the Special 1 colorization with Game Boy. And then I also prefer to use an LCD grid shader with my handheld systems like Game Boy and Game Boy Advance. And so I like to go in here and set those up individually. Now, I'm a huge fan of the 8-bit and 16-bit era, so I like to tweak these to my own settings. And specifically what I like to do is turn on bilinear filtering, and then also add a normal filter. Typically I would use a normal 2x, but the chip in this is powerful enough that you can use a normal 4x filter. That's going to give you really nice balanced pixels, and it's still going to run at full speed. So I recommend for Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Genesis, everything else like that, go in and turn on bilinear filtering and the normal 4x filter. I'll show that off here in a minute what that looks like. But as you can see, I did that for all the 8-bit and 16-bit systems, Sega CD, 32X, and so on. It only takes a couple minutes to set up, but it's going to improve your gameplay quite a bit. As far as everything else, I actually don't recommend changing anything because the default emulator is typically going to be the best one anyway, and that's already been pre-configured for you. Now within the menu, you can do other things. For example, you can set up retro achievements, or you could even go in here and set up net play if you wanted to play a 2-player mode if you had another friend who had the same device. And I have videos about each of those things if you want to look them up. Some other quick examples, you can go into the game collection and then change which systems you want to have displayed. If there's something showing up that you don't want to see, you can just remove it here. On top of that, there are all sorts of automatic collections you could use. By default, the favorites one is already turned on, but you could make other collections if you wanted. For example, you could make an arcade games collection, or you could add specific genres, for example, fighting games or racing games. Now there are a couple important settings within the system settings. For example, this is where you would adjust the brightness of the display. I found this display gets really bright, and so I tend to keep it down on the lower end of the brightness. Also within this menu, you can update the firmware via the internet, and if you want to SSH into the device, this is where the password is going to reside as well. Now, under the UI settings menu, you can adjust the theme and also tweak it. And there are already 3 that are available, but you can also download more if you'd like, and I'll show you that here later. There's a few settings within sound settings, but not a lot. And then also under network settings, this is where you're going to actually connect to the internet. And finally, under the main menu, the last thing I want to show off is Moonlight Game Streaming. Now, this is something you could run via the Android side as well, but it's nice that it's here within Linux too. And it's actually pretty easy to set up. In fact, on the JELOS website, they have a whole tutorial to walk you through the whole process. On top of that, they even show you how to set it up to play over the internet and not just your local Wi-Fi. Also, within the wiki page, it shows you how to back up and restore all of your save data if you wanted to use that too. So say, for example, you could start up a game on this device and then resume it on your computer. And so if you're interested, all of those instructions are going to be here on the wiki page. And then that last option here in the menu is the scraper. This is going to allow you to add box art to your games if you don't have them already. Now, in addition to that main menu, there's also a tools menu, and some of these things are worth highlighting too. For example, this is where you would access the cloud backup and restore of your save games once you have that set up. On top of that, there is a JELOS add-ons repository. This is where you're going to add the Nintendo DS Drastic emulator. And JELOS also supports Portmaster. This is going to allow you to load a bunch of different ports. There's over 100 available right now. On top of that, if you're a Mac user, it will remove the .and underscore files. If you've ever seen those, you know what I'm talking about. And you can dive right into your apps from here too, so you could start up RetroArch or PSP or ScumVM right here. And theme masters like Portmaster, but it allows you to download different themes. And there's a whole repository and walkthrough for this, and I'll also leave that in the video description. But basically, you can browse through the names of various themes that are going to fit your device dimensions, and then you can download them directly onto the RG353P. And so here I've downloaded a couple themes and I'm testing them out, but honestly I just prefer the default one, so I'm going to use that one instead. And so in a nutshell, that's how JELOS works and what the navigation is like. And so the first thing I did once I had JELOS set up is that I set up a bunch of ports, and it was really easy to set up. I actually have videos for most of these already. And each of these ports work really well. For example, here is Celeste. It is running in a 4:3 aspect ratio, which does make it a little bit squished looking, but you can also go into the options and change it to letterboxed if you'd like. Other games, like Streets of Rage Remake, actually work really well in 4:3. And I may or may not be working on a video for a special port that should be coming out here pretty soon. And I gotta say, playing this game on a retro handheld like this just feels really fitting. Now, I also wanted to show off a little bit of 16-bit gameplay. Like I mentioned before, I use that normal 4x filter to balance out the pixels, and that setup works out really well. As you can see here, Mega Man X is scaled perfectly, it's running at full speed, and the life bar on the left is nice and balanced. And so here is Super Mario World 2, and as you can see, it's also running at full speed and looks great. On top of that, if we press select in R2, it'll go into fast forward mode, and the frame rate will bump up all the way to 90 frames per second. That's a great indication that you have a lot of headroom here to play this at full speed. Even when using a hefty filter like normal 4x to balance the picture, it's still going to run really well. And so I'd say that any of those 8-bit, 16-bit systems, anything that runs natively at a 4:3 aspect ratio is going to run really well on this device, just like it did on stock firmware, but now you can also use that normal 4x filter and still get full speed. But in the review, I did complain about how Sega Saturn, Dreamcast, and PSP were not really that great. And so for the rest of the video, I'm going to show off the gameplay in JELOS for those 3 systems. And so we'll start with Sega Saturn first. One thing to note here is it's going to by default run at a 2x resolution, which will cause some slowdown. Instead, what I recommend is going into the settings and changing it to a 1x resolution. And then so that's what I've done for every one of those games here. One other thing to note is the standalone Yaba-san Shiro emulator, which is the one we're going to be using here, does run with an auto frame skip. So if you look up at the top left, you can see that there's a number by this skip. And that's an indication of how many frames are needed to skip in order to give you a smooth gameplay experience. For some games, that number is going to be close to 0, which means that this is going to be running at full speed altogether at a full frame rate. But with other games, you may see it jump up all the way close to 30, and if it has to go anything over 30, what you'll actually find is a little bit of slowdown too. Regardless, I found that the Saturn gameplay was perfectly playable for me, and the performance here is much better than I was expecting. I would say this is almost twice as good as it is on the RK3326, which already has pretty good Saturn. So I would make a note here of the speed in Virtua Fighter 2 as we're seeing on the screen. It is running with a frame skip that's getting pretty close to 30, but all the same it's still running nice and smooth and fast. If we play that same game on an RK3326 device, as you can see here, it's running at about half that same speed. And to me, that's a very impressive difference for a chip that's only about 30% faster than the RK3326. Okay, so what I'm going to do here, I've plugged in a headphone jack so that you can get a very crisp and clear audio, and then I'm just going to shut up for a few minutes so you can see the Saturn gameplay for yourself. And I'll come back in a minute when we're ready for Dreamcast. Okay, when it came to Dreamcast, we're going to stay within RetroArch using the Flycast core here, which is set up by default. Also, like with Sega Saturn, this has an auto frame skip enabled as well. And so if you're watching the frame rate on the top right here, you're going to see a dip way below 60 frames per second for a lot of these games. But what you'll also find is that the gameplay is relatively smooth. And so yes, this is not perfect Dreamcast experience either, but much like with Saturn, I still find this to be very playable. You're definitely going to hear some audio crackling, but the gameplay itself is pretty smooth. And so my assessment here is that if you are a Dreamcast diehard fan, you want everything to play perfectly, this is not a great fit. But if you're not that concerned about the perfect gameplay experience and you just want to play some Dreamcast games, this is going to be pretty good. Now it's the same story with the Thomas Wave and Naomi games. These are going to use the same core and the performance is same across the board as well. But I will note that there are about 5% of games that just for some reason don't play well at all. Virtua Cop 2 is a great example. As you can see here, it's just chugging at like 10 frames per second. And unfortunately, the same thing happened with Sega Rally Championship 2. But of all the games that I tried, those were the only two that had issues. And so I'm going to shut up here and let the games play out, and I'll let you make your own judgments.
Go that way. Trust me, relax. All right. Yeah.
Taxi.
Let's go. I got it. Gosh,
Time bonus.
I always do better. See ya. I've been anytime. Oh, wait up. Don't refuse me. Oh!
Hey.
Hey, mister! Let's play baseball!
Sorry, maybe later, okay?
Here goes!
Love 15. Love 30.
Fight 2. Ready? Go!
Now, in order to get good PSP gameplay, there are some things we're going to have to tweak. For example, by default, JELOS has it set up where it skipped buffered rendering. What that means is that certain aspects are not going to draw perfectly. In this example with Ridge Racer, the car itself does not have any light reflecting from it. If you notice, the back window is completely black here and there is no light reflecting on the car at all. But when you have it on this setting, it actually gives you a 2x resolution and looks really sharp and clear even on a small display like this one. And so you may not like this experience. Personally, I don't like it either. And so we can press L3, go into the settings, and then turn on buffered rendering. Now at the same time, we need to also turn it down to a 1x resolution for PSP 2. But as you can see here, now the car actually reflects the ambient light. And this is what it looked like on the original PSP. And I'm kind of a stickler for having that original experience, and so I prefer buffered rendering. And when I'm testing PSP, this is how I prefer to have it set up. I like to have the original experience. But this does have a performance cost. For example, we're only using a 1x resolution, and it will have some slowdowns in some of the busier scenes. But across the board, the PSP emulation on JELOS is way better than it was on stock, and in fact this actually plays better than it did on Android, which was surprising to me. Now some games are not going to run at full speed even if you skip the buffer effects. This game here, which is Wipeout Pulse, is a great example. This one struggles to maintain 60 frames per second. Now you have a couple options. Usually what I would do is turn on a frame skip or an auto frame skip, and that's going to kind of resolve everything. But that often will result in a choppy gameplay experience. Another option you could do with this build that's within JELOS is actually just lower the overall frame rate. So under Force Max FPS here, you could change it to 30 frames per second instead. What that means is the PSP is going to think that 30 frames per second is the max speed of this game. And so this kind of levels the playing field here, where it's going to play at 30 frames per second, which of course is not going to be as smooth as 60 frames, but all the same you're not going to get any slowdown. This is the same kind of trick that people will use on things like the Steam Deck in order to get good gameplay. And you're not just limited to 30 or 60 frames per second, you could use something in between. For example, Outrun 2006 plays really well at 40 frames per second. And while of course this isn't going to be as smooth as full speed at 60 frames, it's still a lot better than 30. And so I'm going to let the rest of the gameplay play out right now, but just pay attention to the frame rate on the top right and you can see whether or not I reduced it to 30, or you can play it at 60, and so on. Overall, I would say that when using JELOS and then using these tweaks as well, PSP is not so bad on this device either. But of course, it's not going to be perfect. For example, as you can see here with God of War, I'm running it at a max 30 frames per second and then also turned on a frame skip. And so it's running at a decent speed, but it's also only 15 frames per second, which to me is unacceptable. Anyway, let's show off a few more games here so you can get an idea of the performance. Alright everyone, that's about it for this video. I just wanted to show you that there is custom firmware already available for the RG353P. It's kind of amazing that it's only been 2 days since this device even went on sale and we already have these great solutions. And given the fact that there are so many people that are interested in this device, I think this one's going to have some pretty long legs. So let me know what you think in the comments below. For $130 to $140, is this device worth it, or is it worth waiting for something else? I will say that the improved game performance and the user experience make me a lot more excited for this device, and I'm interested to see how the community thinks about it once everyone starts getting it in their hands too. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.